My name is Emily Seaboyer. I own and operate Locusart Jewelry Designs right here in Nova Scotia. I am a jewelry designer. I work specifically with silver and gold of all carats. You're studying jewelry design at university, and that becomes your major. The very first project you learn to make is a very humble band ring, but I find it's the artist's interpretation, or the artist's ability rather, to interpret a band ring and to make it their own by adding design interest is what will separate it from the very basic, the very beginner projects to something that is truly beautiful. So the first thing we're going to do is start with a larger piece of stock. This is about twice the size of what we actually need, and I'm using what's called a miter box or a tube cutter to accurately file one end, so everything is just so. So I'm just filing off the very smallest amount of surface area so that I can get a flat edge. Never ever want to waste any gold because it costs far too much money. And when this edge is perfectly flush, it gives us a straight edge to work with. So I pre-measured the length in case you're wondering why this is quicker than it should be. The ring I'm making today is created using a fabrication method, which means I'm using entirely hand tools as opposed to any kind of casting equipment. This is a jeweler's saw. It's a very tiny version of a coping saw. When we finish sawing, you're left with a very, very clean line, with the exception of one edge where the metal has been pulled apart. I've left approximately 0.5 millimeter margin between the line where the measurement will be filed and where it's been sawn, so that way we'll have the absolute perfect edge to work with. If these first steps aren't done with absolute precision, then the entire ring will follow suit, and none of the measurements will be accurate. I use a coarse file to get rid of a bulk of metal, and then a finer file to prepare it for any soldering or fabrication. So now our ring stock is roughed out and prepared. This is a ring bender. For the first 3 years of training in jewelry design, they don't even tell you that there is such a thing as a ring bender. You do all of this by hand. So when you're roughing out a ring, you start with the largest setting and work your way down as necessary. Now this band will be size 7, and you just get started very carefully with one end. With square stock, it's especially important and sometimes difficult to make sure that the stock is exactly as it should be in the ring bender, so that it's not twisted in any way. Otherwise your final product will be twisted. You bend it through in tiny little increments to avoid any extra marring or marking during this process. Different stocks will come in different, will be available in different alloys. Yellow gold is commonly available in 14 karat, 10 karat, 14 karat, 18 karat, sometimes 22 karat. Now as I work with this gold as well, it becomes harder and harder. So I'm hoping that because this fabrication process is a relatively simple one, we won't need to go through the extra step of annealing the metal, warming it, and softening it. So because we've been working with this gold to some degree, it's becoming work hardened, and we have a nice curve. Each end of the band ring would normally, with a classic straightforward design, you would want those to meet perfectly in the center. For this design, we're going to have them overlap by 4 millimeters. And because we've got this nice spring here, I can pull the band, the two ends of the band, across one another. And so it gives us the tension that we need and holds the two pieces closer together. So now I'll continue to bend the ring and prepare it for where we want it to be for soldering. The ring is still very much oval shaped, so we'll need to work on that too. So we've got the overlap that we need with this ring and a certain amount of tension. So what I'll do is work with hand tools just for a little bit to make sure that the end pieces are round. They need to be on the same curve as the rest of the band. Once it's been soldered, I'll hammer it on a mandrel to make sure that everything is just perfect. So what I'm doing right now is using ring bending pliers, which are curved on one side, and I'm just using these to tighten up the ends of this ring and to get them in the right position for soldering. What happens when we're bending our metal is it gets a lot of oils and grease on it from your hands, from your skin, and that needs to be cleaned off, otherwise the solder won't flow properly during that process. What I'm doing is cleaning it in a very mild acid solution in what we refer to as a pickle pot. So this is a really mild solution and quite safe. It works better when it's warm. What I'm doing here is cutting my solder. Now this is 14 karat yellow gold solder, and I am cutting the solder into tiny little pallions. They're about 1 millimeter square, and I'm cutting these into the lid of my flux container. Flux is used to clean your metal, to keep it from oxidizing during the heating and soldering process, and it helps your solder to flow properly. Just paint the flux onto your solder so that it can be picked up easily with the solder pick. So we'll do the same thing with our ring. I'll paint it entirely in flux to keep the metal from overheating. This is really, really important because when the metal overheats, it discolors. You have to heat the entire piece overall, otherwise it will act as a heat sink and your solder won't flow in the right direction, in the right place. And you'll heat it until the flux bubbles and then becomes clear. Then you'll know it's ready to be soldered. So I'm soldering the back of the seam. Or very rarely, I should say, never say never, but very rarely would you want to solder the top of the seam, because sometimes the solder flows a little extra, and cleanup is made easier on the inside. It keeps the outside of your band ring looking flush and seamless. So I'll be using a rawhide mallet. That way we can shape the ring without marking the metal. And I'm using a steel mandrel. The ring is perfectly round now. We've taken out any imperfections, and it is ready for a pre-polish. Our first line of finishing is complete. Here is just filing each end of the band ring where they meet, so that they're soft and fit comfortably and won't catch on clothing or other objects. We're ready to start with the next layer of finishing. Use a rouge polish, which is the finest and final step. When you're finishing a band ring, you can use any number of emery papers, files, Dremel tools to give you the desired finished results. This can be a process that requires a dozen steps, or in this case 3 or 4. Choosing a finish that is compatible with the design is a very educated choice, and it really depends on what you want your final results to look like.